The town of Briar Hollow didn't appear all at once. It emerged the way rot does, slowly, subtly, out of trees that leaned too close to the road and fog that never fully lifted. Even at noon, Silas Crow drove in just after dawn, windshield wipers ticking back and forth through a fine, needling rain. The highway narrowed into a two-lane artery, choked by moss and blackberry vines, and then there it was, a sagging welcome sign, white paint flaking, the word hollow almost entirely eaten away. Population 2,417, according to the last census. Fewer now, probably. Places like this shed people the way wet dogs shed fur. The call had come in at 3:12 a.m. A local woman was found in the woods behind the old Grayson Mill. Partial remains. The sheriff sounded shaken, which was never a good sign. Silas parked beside the only gas station in town, a squat concrete box with barred windows, and killed the engine. The silence pressed in immediately. No traffic, no birds, just the distant rush of the river and the occasional metallic groan from somewhere deep in the forest, like a breath pulled through rusted lungs. He took his coat and badge and headed toward the tree line where a cluster of patrol cars idled, their lights muted by fog. Yellow tape sagged between alder trunks, already damp and losing its authority. The sheriff stood just inside the perimeter, middle-aged, thick-necked, eyes rimmed red. His name patch read Weller, though his hand shook too much for Silas to bother reading it closely. "You're Crow," the sheriff said. Not a question. Silas nodded. "Show me." They ducked under the tape. The ground dipped and softened almost immediately, earth turning to sponge underfoot. Ferns brushed Silas's legs, leaving cold beads of water behind. The smell hit him next, sweet at first, then unmistakably wrong. The body wasn't whole. What remained lay arranged at the base of a cedar, like something set out deliberately. The torso was present, clothed in a gray sweater darkened by rain and blood. The head was gone. So were both arms. The cuts weren't jagged. They were careful, surgical, almost. Silas crouched, ignoring the wet seeping through his slacks. He studied the edges of the wounds, the way the flesh had been separated cleanly. No tearing. No animal did this. No accident either. "How long?" he asked. "Hard to say," the sheriff replied. "Ground's cold. Rain's been steady all night. Could be hours, could be longer." Silas scanned the area. No drag marks, no sign of a struggle. Whatever had happened, it hadn't happened here, or it had happened with terrifying efficiency. He noticed something then, half hidden beneath the body. A strip of fabric, folded neatly. He gestured to the techs, and one of them carefully lifted it free. It was a child's sock. Pink, with little white rabbits stitched along the side. Silas felt a tightness behind his eyes. He forced it down. "Victim ID?" he asked. The sheriff hesitated. "We think it's Mara Ellison, 34. Lived on Alder Road with her husband. Worked nights at the cannery." "Think?" "Dental records will confirm, but she was reported missing yesterday afternoon. Didn't pick up her daughter from school." Silas stood, looking deeper into the woods. The fog thickened between the trees, swallowing distance, making the forest feel endless and claustrophobic all at once. "Where's the head?" he asked. The sheriff swallowed. "Haven't found it yet." They searched for hours, expanded the perimeter, brought in dogs. The forest resisted them at every turn, branches clawing, mud sucking at boots, fog disorienting even seasoned officers. The dogs lost the scent repeatedly, circling back on themselves, whining. By noon, they found the arms. They were placed carefully on a fallen log about 50 yards uphill, palms facing up, fingers relaxed. Someone had washed them. The skin was pale, almost luminous against the dark bark. On the left wrist, a faint tan line where a watch had once been. Silas stared at them longer than he should have. This wasn't rage. This wasn't panic. This was intention. Back in town, Briar Hollow watched. People lingered in doorways. Curtains twitched. Conversations died when Silas passed. Fear here didn't look like hysteria. It looked like recognition. The Ellison house sat at the end of Alder Road, a narrow lane choked by overgrowth. A swing set in the yard creaked in the breeze, one chain broken, the seat tilted like a snapped jaw. Inside, the house smelled of old coffee and bleach. Too much bleach. In the bathroom sink, Silas found pink-tinged water stains around the drain. Recently scrubbed. Not well enough. In the bedroom closet, he found Mara's shoes lined up with obsessive neatness. One pair was missing. On the kitchen table sat a drawing, done in crayon. A woman with no arms, no head. A little girl stood beside her, holding a sock with rabbits on it. Silas felt the room tilt, just slightly. "Where's the daughter?" he asked quietly. The sheriff's voice came from behind him. "That's the thing." Silas turned. "She's still missing." Silas Crow stayed in the kitchen long after the sheriff stopped talking. The drawing lay between them, waxy crayon strokes pressed hard into cheap paper, the lines gouged deep enough to scar the table beneath. The woman's body was colored gray. The girl was yellow, her smile too wide, eyes black dots punched through the page. No sun, no sky, just the two of them, floating. "How old is she?" Silas asked. "6, Sheriff Weller said. "Lena Ellison, 1st grade." Silas nodded once. He folded the paper carefully and slid it into an evidence sleeve himself. His hands were steady. Inside, something had begun to coil. They found no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. The back door had been unlocked. The mudroom rug was damp, as if someone had come in from the rain and not bothered to wipe their feet. In the laundry room, the washing machine still smelled faintly of detergent and iron. Blood washed out in a hurry. Silas stood in the doorway and imagined the sequence. Mara coming home from a night shift, exhausted. Someone she knew letting themselves in, or already inside. No screaming, no neighbors calling it in. Briar Hollow was quiet like that. People learned early what sounds to ignore. Outside, the river whispered beyond the trees, swollen from rain. They set up a command post at the sheriff's station, an old brick building that had once been a post office. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with mildew and burnt coffee. Maps of the town were tacked to corkboards, roads marked in red grease pencil. Photos of Mara's remains were clipped up, partially obscured out of a vague sense of decency that fooled no one. By late afternoon, the volunteers arrived. Locals with weathered faces and hunting jackets, boots caked with mud. Some of them Silas recognized immediately, not by name, but by posture. Men who knew the woods intimately. Men who moved through trees like they belonged there. He didn't like that. Silas gathered them briefly, laid out search grids, reminded them not to touch anything. They nodded, solemn, eyes flicking to the photos on the wall and away again. One man crossed himself. Another smiled faintly, then realized he was doing it and stopped. As the groups filtered out, a deputy lingered. Young, freckled, nervous energy humming under his skin. "Detective," he said. "There's something else." Silas followed him into the back office. The deputy pulled open a desk drawer and produced a manila folder, edges soft with age. "We had an incident here," the deputy said. 3 years ago. Never made the news." Sheriff at the time kept it quiet. Silas opened the folder. Inside was a missing persons report. Female, 9 years old. Abigail Moore. Vanished from a campsite just outside town. No body. No suspect. Case closed quietly after 6 months. Silas scanned the attached photo. A smiling girl with crooked teeth and a familiar shape to her eyes. "Why wasn't this escalated?" he asked. The deputy swallowed. "Sheriff said it was a custody thing. Parents were complicated." Silas closed the folder slowly. "What happened to the parents?" "Mother moved away. Father drank himself into a grave last winter." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like fingers impatient to be let in. They searched until dark. At 7:43 p.m., a volunteer radioed in. Voice shaking. Something found near the riverbank, downstream from the mill. Silas arrived to find a cluster of flashlights aimed at the mud. The river churned nearby, black and fast. On the ground lay a small sneaker, half buried, purple with Velcro straps. Inside it, still warm despite the cold, was a child's foot. Nearby, pressed into the mud with deliberate care, were footprints, bare, adult-sized. They circled the spot once, twice, then walked calmly into the river and vanished. Silas stared at the water. The current carried leaves, branches, the occasional glint of trash. Anything light enough would be gone by now. Anything heavy would lodge somewhere downstream, waiting. "Get dive teams," he said, "and lock this town down." The sheriff hesitated. "That'll cause panic." Silas turned to him, eyes flat. "It already has." That night, Silas didn't sleep. He sat in the spare office at the station, jacket draped over a chair, staring at the wall. He replayed the crime scene again and again, adjusting variables, testing motives, the precision, the cleanliness, the way the body had been arranged, not hidden, a message, but not a loud one, something meant for someone specific. At 2:17 a.m. the phone rang. They'd found the head. It was placed on the steps of the old Grayson Mill, facing the town. The eyes were open. The mouth had been cleaned carefully, lips pale, almost peaceful. Carved into the forehead, shallow but unmistakable, was a single word: remember. Silas crouched in front of it, rain soaking his hair, the mill looming behind him like a carcass picked clean. This wasn't just a murder. This was a reckoning. By morning, Briar Hollow was no longer pretending. Roadblocks went up on both ends of town, cones and flares glowing weakly through fog. State patrol cruisers idled at intersections that hadn't seen enforcement in years. The cafe on Main Street never opened. Church bells rang once at dawn, an old habit, automatic, then fell silent when no one came. Silas Crow stood in the sheriff's station locker room, washing dried blood from his hands. The water ran rust-colored for a moment before clearing. He stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. This case was already inside him, rearranging things. The forensic report came in piecemeal. Maura Ellison had been dismembered post-mortem. Cause of death: asphyxiation. No defensive wounds, no drugs in her system. She had trusted whoever killed her enough not to fight, or hadn't been given the chance. The cuts were made with a fine-toothed blade, not a hunting knife. not a chainsaw. Something smaller, precise, familiar with anatomy. The arms had been washed in river water, cold, methodical. The word carved into her forehead hadn't been done in anger. The edges were shallow, controlled, almost reverent. Silas listened, nodded, asked questions that sounded procedural and felt hollow. They still hadn't found Lena. The dive teams recovered nothing but debris. The river kept its secrets. By noon, the search radius expanded outward from the water, back into the woods, into town itself. Officers knocked on doors that had been shut for years. Some residents answered too quickly, faces stiff with rehearsed innocence. Others refused outright. Silas noticed patterns. Certain houses had their lights on in the daytime. Certain people avoided eye contact too carefully. Fear didn't move evenly through Briar Hollow. It pooled. At 1:30 p.m., Silas asked for a list of everyone who'd lived in town more than 10 years. The sheriff frowned. That's most of us. Exactly. They set up interviews in the community hall, folding chairs, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of damp coats and old wood. One by one, the long-term residents sat across from Silas. Names, alibis, shrugs. When he asked about Abigail Moore, the room shifted. Some people claimed they barely remembered her. Others said the family had been strange. One woman said the girl had wandered off, probably drowned. A man in a logging jacket muttered something about kids needing watching. Silas wrote it all down. Halfway through the interviews, a woman in her late 40s sat down and immediately began to cry. Not quietly, not performatively, just a steady, leaking grief she seemed exhausted by. Her name was Elaine Mercer. She worked at the library, had worked there forever. I should have said something, she whispered, staring at the table. I knew it was wrong. Silas leaned forward slightly. What was wrong? She shook her head, hair clinging to her wet cheeks. The meetings, the way they talked about the girls. Who's they? Elaine looked up then, eyes bloodshot and terrified. The men, not all of them, just some. They said it was about protection, about keeping the town clean. Silas felt his pulse slow, sharpen. Where were these meetings held? She hesitated too long. The mill, she said finally. After it shut down, they'd drink, talk, sometimes bring their kids, teach them to be quiet. Silas closed his notebook. Did you ever see Abigail Moore there? Elaine nodded once. She stopped coming after a while. Her dad asked questions. Then she disappeared. Silas stood. Who led these meetings? Elaine's mouth opened. Then the power cut out. The lights died mid-buzz. The room plunged into gray shadow, daylight leaking weakly through the high windows. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped. A deputy swore and reached for his radio. Silas was already moving. Outside, the town had gone eerily still. No engines, no voices. Just the low rush of the river and the distant creak of trees. A child's laughter drifted through the fog. High, close. Silas followed the sound without thinking. Boots hitting wet pavement, then dirt. It led him behind the community hall, toward the tree line. There, nailed to an alder trunk at eye level, was another drawing. Crayon again. A group of men this time, all faceless. Hands too big. A little girl in the center, her mouth open in a black oval. Above them, written in a careful childish hand, "You said it was a game." Silas tore it down as radios crackled back to life behind him. "Detective!" someone shouted. "We've got a situation at the mill." Silas ran. The old Grayson mill loomed out of the fog, its broken windows dark and blind. Patrol lights flashed blue and red against rotting wood. Officers stood back, weapons drawn, fear rolling off them in waves. On the front doors, painted in thick, dripping red, was a message that hadn't been there an hour earlier. One of you knows where she is. And beneath it, hanging from a meat hook driven into the wood, was a small pink sock, with rabbits stitched along the side. No one touched the sock. It swayed gently in the draft, slipping through the mill's warped boards, rotating just enough for the rabbits to appear and disappear in the sweep of patrol lights. Someone gagged. Another officer turned away and retched into the gravel. Silas Crow stepped forward anyway. He slipped on gloves, lifted the sock carefully. It was damp. Still warm. "Get everyone out of here who doesn't need to be," he said. "Now." The sheriff hesitated again. Always a beat too slow. Silas didn't wait for permission. He ducked under the sagging threshold and went inside the mill. The interior smelled of old oil, wet wood, and something coppery underneath it all. The main floor opened wide, machinery long, stripped or rusted into useless hulks. Graffiti layered the walls. Years of bored teenagers and drunk men, but the center of the room had been cleared. Chairs, a dozen of them, arranged in a loose circle. In the middle sat a plastic storage bin. The lid was cracked. Silas approached it slowly. Every instinct screamed restraint, but this wasn't a bomb. This was theater. He lifted the lid. Inside were shoes. Small ones. Children's shoes. Some muddy. Some clean. A pair with purple Velcro straps lay on top. Lena's other shoe. Silas closed the bin gently. On the far wall, illuminated by a single hanging work light, were photographs. Dozens of them, printed, taped up in uneven rows. They depicted the woods, the river, the mill, and children, not posed, not smiling, watching, hiding behind trees, peering through gaps in floorboards, faces half visible in shadow, eyes wide, mouths pressed shut by small hands. Some of the photos were old, colors faded, clothing styles dated. Abigail Moore was there. So were at least 3 other girls Silas didn't recognize. His jaw tightened until it hurt. Behind him, floorboards creaked. Silas didn't turn. "Elaine Mercer," he said quietly. She stopped. "I told them not to," she whispered. "I told them it wasn't right. They said it was just stories. Just teaching the girls fear so they'd behave." Silas turned then. Elaine stood just inside the doorway, rain slicking her coat, eyes hollow. In her hands, she held a camera. Old. Film. The kind that forced attention. "You took the photos," Silas said. She nodded. "At first, they wanted records, proof they were behaving. Later, I kept them because I didn't know what else to do." "Who's they?" Her shoulders sagged. "You know." Silas thought of the interviews. The men who'd smiled too carefully. The ones who'd spoken about order, about children needing discipline. "Where's Lena?" he asked. Elaine's breath hitched. "Alive, for now." Silas felt the words like a blade sliding between ribs. "Where?" She looked past him, deeper into the mill, toward a narrow stairwell half hidden behind machinery. "Below," she said. "They used the old cold room, said it kept the noise down." Silas keyed his radio without breaking eye contact. "I need a team inside. Now, quiet." Elaine's eyes filled. "They're coming," she said. "They always come back when the lights go out." As if summoned, headlights flared through the fog outside. Engines. More than one. Silas moved. He took the stairs 2 at a time, weapon raised, heart steady in a way that frightened him. The lower level was colder, concrete sweating moisture. The smell was stronger here. Iron and rot and fear. A door stood at the end of the hall, reinforced, newer than the rest. From behind it came a sound so small it almost vanished beneath the hum of generators restarting above. Whimpering, Silas kicked the door in. Lena Ellison sat on the floor, wrists bound loosely with duct tape, eyes huge in her thin face. She looked up at him and didn't scream. She just stared, as if she'd already learned screaming didn't help. Silas knelt immediately, tearing the tape away. "It's okay," he said, voice low, controlled. "You're safe." She shook her head once, tiny, certain. "They said you'd say that," she whispered. Footsteps thundered above them, men shouting. Angry now, panicked. Silas lifted Lena into his arms and turned toward the exit, just as the first figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Sheriff Weller. Gun in his hand. His face wasn't shaking anymore. "Put her down," Weller said. "This doesn't concern you." Silas didn't move. "How many?" Silas asked. Weller smiled thinly. "Enough." More men filled in behind him. Locals. Volunteers. Faces Silas had seen all day. Lena buried her face in Silas's coat. "They made Mommy sleep," she murmured. Silas tightened his grip on her and raised his gun. "You taught them silence," he said. "Now you're going to learn it." The lights overhead flickered, and then the shooting started. The first shot tore into the concrete above Silas's head, spraying grit and dust. He twisted sideways, shielding Lena with his body as he dove behind a rusted compressor. The sound in the enclosed space was deafening, gunfire cracking, echoing, overlapping until it became a single continuous roar. Men were shouting now, not orders, not coordination. Panic. Silas returned fire once, deliberately, aiming low. A scream followed, sharp and immediate. Someone fell. Others scrambled, boots slipping on damp concrete. These weren't professionals. They were men who'd hunted deer and bullied children, and never expected resistance. "Stay down," Silas murmured into Lena's hair. She was trembling so hard it felt like holding a live wire. A deputy's voice cut through the chaos. "Weller, stop! Drop it!" Silas risked a glance. The deputy, freckled, terrified, stood halfway down the stairs, gun shaking in his hands. Sheriff Weller had turned on him, face twisted with a kind of weary contempt. "You don't understand," Weller said. "This is how we kept it from getting worse." He fired. The deputy went down without a sound. Silas felt something rupture behind his sternum. Cold. Focused. He rose just enough to see Weller clearly and fired twice. The first shot caught Weller in the shoulder, spinning him. The second took him in the chest. The sheriff stumbled backward, collided with one of the men behind him, and both went down the stairs in a tangle of limbs and screaming. Silas didn't wait to see who got up. He moved, fast and controlled, toward the side exit he'd clocked earlier. Smoke stung his eyes. Alarms were sounding now. Someone had hit the old fire system. Water rained down, turning blood into pink rivulets that ran toward the drains. By the time Silas burst out into the fog, State patrol units were arriving at speed, lights tearing through the dark. Officers poured out, weapons up, voices sharp and trained. Silas held Lena high, away from the chaos, his badge visible. "She's alive," he shouted. "Get her medical." Now. Hands took her from him gently. She didn't let go until the last possible second, fingers clawing at his coat. Then she was wrapped in a blanket and carried away. Silas turned back toward the mill. The shooting had stopped. Inside, the survivors were being dragged out one by one, some wounded, some sobbing, some silent, in the way only deeply guilty people get. Elaine Mercer was led out in cuffs, her face emptied of everything but relief and dread. They found more below the mill. A second room, smaller, no door, just a curtain. Inside were mattresses on the floor, not beds, nothing so kind. Walls scratched with marks, tallies maybe, or attempts at calendars, names etched into the concrete with bits of metal. Abigail, Lena, others. They found bones buried near the riverbank at first light. Small ones. By noon, Briar Hollow was unrecognizable. News vans clogged Main Street. Helicopters thudded overhead. The cafe opened for the cameras and closed again an hour later. People cried openly now. Others raged. Some locked themselves inside and refused to speak. Silas sat on the back bumper of an ambulance, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. A state investigator approached, older, calm. "You saved the girl," he said. "That won't be forgotten." Silas stared at the fog thinning over the trees. "They'd been doing it for years," the investigator nodded. "Small towns are good at that, making things disappear." Across the lot, Lena sat with a medic, a stuffed bear pressed to her chest. She looked smaller somehow, like someone who'd stepped back into her body after being gone too long. She glanced up and met Silas's eyes. Didn't smile, just nodded. That night, as the last of the sirens faded and Briar Hollow finally slept, Silas stood alone at the riverbank. The water kept moving. It always would. Some things were carried away. Others stayed buried, waiting for someone to remember. And this time, someone had. Now, let's get right into the next story for tonight. The sea had already given the body back once. Detective Devin Burrows stood at the edge of the wharf in Blackwater Cove. Collar turned up against a wind that cut like it had something personal to settle. Late February had hollowed the town out. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and old iron. No tourists, no noise, just the slow grind of survival and the occasional gull that sounded like it was laughing at you. The body lay on a blue tarp beside a stack of lobster traps, zipped into a black vinyl bag that shivered faintly in the gusts. One boot protruded. Men's. Size 11, maybe 12. The sole was worn thin on the outside edge, the kind of gait you got after years of favoring a hip that never healed right. They'd pulled him from the water at 4:26 a.m.a. Lobsterman named Cal Dorney had felt his net snag on something heavier than rock. Thought it was scrap until an arm surfaced, pale, swollen, fingers curled as if they died mid-grab. Cal had cut the engine and stared for a full minute before calling it in, because even men who lived with death for a living still had moments when their brains refused to name what their eyes were seeing. Devin crouched beside the tarp and nodded to the medical examiner, Dr. Kessler, local contract, competent, humorless. She knelt and unzipped the bag halfway. The face was wrong. Not ruined by the sea, not decomposed enough for that. Just wrong, in a way that made the skin on Devin's forearms tighten. Jonah Smith's eyes were open, glassed over, fixed on the low gray sky. His skin looked stretched, tightened by cold into a mask. And his mouth had been sewn shut with thick black thread, stitches wide and ugly, dragging the lips into a faint, obscene smile. Someone had done it by hand. No neat surgical work, just brute patience. Devin didn't speak for a beat. He watched Kessler's gloved fingers hover near the thread and stop. "Don't cut it yet," Devin said quietly. Kessler glanced up. "I wasn't going to." "You want photos first. I want to know if it's tied to anything else." "In this town," she gave a small, tired shrug. "Everything's tied to everything else." Devin stood and looked out over the harbor. Fog sat low on the water, thinning but not lifting, like it didn't trust what waited above it. Boats rocked gently, lines creaking. The sound carried too far in the cold. "ID?" he asked. The harbor master, a small man with cracked hands and a beard full of salt, cleared his throat. "We think it's Jonas Smith." Devin's jaw set. Smith wasn't a name you forgot here. Jonas Smith had run the Blackwater cannery before it shuttered, before it became a gray, hulking carcass at the edge of town. He'd been the kind of man who did harm politely, smiling while he cut hours, nodding while he refused safety equipment, shaking hands with a lawyer while fishermen lost their boats. "How sure are you?" Devin asked. "Boots," the harbor master said. He limped. Bad hip. Wore those same damn things in July and January. Devin glanced down at the boot again. Scuffed toe. Oil stain that never quite came out. A man's stubbornness embedded into leather. "Anyone report him missing?" Devin asked. A deputy, Carmen Lyle, local, sharp-eyed, shifted her weight. "Not officially. Jonah lived alone out on Seaward Road. Folks just assumed he finally left, or died in his house, and no one smelled it yet." Devin nodded, filing it away. In places like Blackwater Cove, absence could last a long time before it became a question. Kessler bent closer, examining Jonah's neck. "No obvious ligature marks," she murmured. "But look here." She angled the body slightly. Just beneath the jawline, where the skin had swollen and tightened, a faint puncture showed, small and neat. Another on the other side. Devin crouched again. The punctures were too symmetrical for accident, too clean for teeth. "Drainage?" Devin asked. Kessler's eyes stayed on the wounds. "Maybe. But I don't like how placed it is. We'll know more once I get him warmed enough to work him." Devin's gaze drifted to Jonah's hands. They were pale and wrinkled from seawater, but the nails, short, clean, no broken fingers, no defensive injuries that screamed panic. That didn't mean there hadn't been a fight. It meant someone had prevented one. He leaned in and caught the faint scent under the salt and diesel. Not rot. Not yet. Something chemical, sweet, artificial. "Bleach," he said. Carmen nodded. "We smelled it too when the body came up. Someone had cleaned Jonah, or tried to." Devin stood, looking beyond the wharf toward the shoreline where the cannery sat, its windows broken, its roofline sagging under snow. Blackwater Cannery had closed 6 years ago, and the town had never forgiven Jonah for it. Not because he'd done it, markets shifted, quotas changed, but because he'd walked away with enough money to land on his feet while everyone else sank. "Bag the thread, preserve it," Devin said, "and get me a full canvas of Seaward Road. I want eyes on Jonah's house before somebody decides to help us by cleaning it." Carmen's expression tightened. You think this is a message? Devin didn't answer right away. He watched a gull land on a piling, cock its head, then lift off again like it had reconsidered. I think it's staged, he said finally. Message implies an audience. I'm not sure who it's for yet. They drove out to Seaward Road in a line of 2 cruisers and a county SUV. The road hugged the coast, narrow and slick with frozen slush. On one side, dark firs pressed close. On the other, the sea churned under a low shelf of fog, gray-white and endless. Jonah Smith's house sat alone at the end of a rutted driveway. Single-story, weathered shingles, porch light off, curtains drawn in every window. The yard was too clean for winter. No drifted snow piles, no scattered branches. Someone had been here recently. Devin approached the front door. No forced entry. The lock looked intact. He tried the knob anyway. It opened. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The heat shut off. The scent hit immediately. Bleach, pine cleaner, something floral layered on top like desperation. A cover-up smell. The living room was neat, to the point of aggression. Furniture aligned. No clutter. No mail on the table. No shoes by the door. It didn't look lived in. It looked reset. Carmen swept the kitchen while Devin moved down the hall. Flashlight beam cutting across framed photos. Jonah, at a younger age, arm around a woman whose face had been scratched out with something sharp. In another photo, Jonah stood outside the cannery with a line of workers behind him, faces blurred, as if the camera had shaken, or as if someone had smeared them later. Devin stopped at the bathroom. The tub was wet. Not damp from humidity. Wet. Beads of water clung to the porcelain. The drain had a faint ring of pinkish residue, scrubbed but not erased. He shone the light closer. In the grout near the tub's edge, something dark had lodged. A strand of coarse black thread, the same as the stitches. "Carmen," he called, voice flat. She appeared at the hallway end, gun low but ready. "What?" he pointed. "He was worked on here." Carmen stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Christ." Devin moved into Jonah's bedroom. The bed was made tight, hospital corners too perfect. On the nightstand sat a small digital clock, still blinking 12 o'clock. Beside it, a leather wallet lay open, empty, like someone had displayed the absence on purpose. He opened the closet. It was mostly empty. 2 shirts, 1 suit jacket, a single pair of slacks. The rest, gone. Not stolen in a rush. Removed. On the closet floor, under a loose board, his flashlight caught a sliver of metal. Devin knelt, pried the board up with a gloved hand, and pulled out a small tin box. The kind people kept fishing lures in. Inside were photographs, old prints, edges curled, and beneath them, a folded paper wrapped in plastic. Devin's throat tightened as he flipped through the photos. Women. Young. Some barely more than girls. All in the same chair, all facing the camera. Some crying, some blank. In the background, the corner of a tiled wall and, unmistakably, the edge of a bathtub, Jonah's bathroom. Devin set the photos down carefully, as if touching them harder would make them more real. He unwrapped the plastic and unfolded the paper. It was a list. Names. Dates. Notes in Jonah's handwriting. Not victims. Payments. Devin stared at the last line longer than the others, not because it stood out, but because he'd seen that name on town letterhead. H. Green. Harbor Committee. Volunteer Fire Board. The kind of man who shook hands at church and chaired fundraisers. Carmen came in behind him and saw the photos, her face drained. "Those were taken here." Devin nodded once. Jonah wasn't just a target. He folded the list back slowly, mind already rearranging. If Jonah kept records like this, he was either blackmailing someone or trying to survive by proving he'd been part of something bigger. Outside, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. Not Carmen's. Not Devin's. Devin lifted his gun and turned toward the doorway, flashlight beam steady. From the hallway, a voice spoke, low, calm, close. "You shouldn't be in there, Detective." The voice came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't be in there, Detective." Devin Burrow didn't flinch. He angled the flashlight down the hall, letting the beam settle before his eyes did. A man stood just outside the bedroom doorway, hands visible, palms open. Late 50s. Gray beard trimmed too neatly for a fisherman. Windbreaker zipped to the throat. Snowmelt clung to his boots. Henry Green. Everyone in Blackwater Cove knew Henry Green. Harbor Committee, volunteer, fire board. Ran the annual winter fuel drive. The kind of man people trusted with keys. "You're trespassing," Green said mildly. Devin kept his gun steady. "You want to say that again?" Standing in a murder scene, Green's eyes flicked, just for a second, to the photos spread across the bed. Something passed over his face. Recognition, not surprise. "So he kept them," Green said, not a question. Carmen stiffened beside Devin. "You know about these?" Green sighed and leaned one shoulder against the wall, like the weight of the house had finally caught up to him. Jonah always did like souvenirs. "Step into the light," Devin said. Green complied. Slowly, his hands didn't shake. That worried Devin more than fear would have. "You're on Jonah's list," Devin said, voice even. "Payments. Dates. Notes." Green smiled faintly. Then he was planning to die. Devin felt the temperature in the room drop another degree. "Explain," he said. Green glanced toward the bathroom, the damp tub, the faint smell of bleach. "Jonah didn't just ruin this town financially. He liked control, liked watching people realize too late they didn't have choices anymore." Carmen cut in. "Those women were passing through," Green said. "Runaways. Addicts. Girls no one filed reports for. Jonah would offer work, housing. Then he'd film them, break them down, sell the leverage." Devin's jaw tightened. "Sell it to who?" Green met his eyes. "Men who didn't want their names attached to anything ugly. Men with reputations to protect. Like you." Green didn't deny it. "I paid to keep my wife from finding out," he said quietly. "Paid to keep my kids from knowing who their father really was." Silence settled heavy and foul. "You helped him," Carmen said, disgust sharp in her voice. "I helped myself," Green replied. "Jonah wasn't subtle. He told me eventually everyone paid. Money, favors, silence." Devin thought of the stitches in Jonah's mouth. Thick black thread. Crude. Intentional. "Who sewed him up?" Devin asked. Green's gaze dropped to the floor. "Not me. But you know who." Another pause. Longer this time. "Someone Jonah thought he'd finally lost control over," Green said. "Someone who learned what he'd done too late to stop it, and too early to forget." Footsteps crunched outside the house. Radios murmured. Backup arriving. Devin stepped closer. "Names, Henry." Green closed his eyes. When he opened them, whatever was left of his careful life was already gone. "Ask around about the cannery clinic," he said. "Night shifts, Volunteer hours. Who had access to needles and thread? Devin nodded once. Hands behind your back. Green didn't resist when Carmen cuffed him. As they led him out, he paused at the doorway and looked back at the bedroom. Jonah always thought the sea would take him, Green said softly. Guess he was wrong. Outside, the fog pressed in again, thick and soundless. Devin stood alone in the bedroom for a moment longer, staring at the photographs, the list, the damp bathtub. Jonah Smith hadn't been killed to be silenced. He'd been killed to be corrected, and whoever had done it wasn't finished yet. Lydia Murray sat in the interview room, with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The room was too warm. Old baseboard heater clicking like it had opinions. The smell of disinfectant was sharp enough to sting the back of Devin Burrow's throat. He stayed standing, leaning against the far wall, giving her space she didn't ask for but seemed to need. Carmen Lyle slid a recorder onto the table and didn't turn it on yet. Start where you want, Devin said. Lydia's eyes stayed on her hands. I came to Blackwater Cove 6 years ago. Seasonal work. Dock office. Jonah liked hiring women who needed money fast. He said it kept things efficient. Devin waited. Silence had weight. He let it settle. He called it documentation. Lydia continued. Said everyone documented everything these days, that he was just being thorough. What did he document? Carmen asked. Lydia exhaled through her nose. A thin, controlled sound. Fear. Compliance. How long it took before someone stopped asking questions. Devin felt his jaw tighten. He filmed me in the bathroom, Lydia said. That tub, same one you found. He told me it was leverage. That if I ever talked, he'd make sure everyone knew what I'd done to survive. What did you do? Devin asked gently. Nothing illegal, she said. Nothing immoral. That's the part people like Jonah never understood. Shame doesn't need facts. She looked up then, eyes glassy but sharp. I left town 2 weeks later, changed my name, tried to forget. And the nurse? Devin asked. Lydia hesitated. She was different, she said. Not like Jonah, not like the men who paid him. She worked the cannery clinic. Quiet, competent, always stayed late. Name, Carmen said. Lydia swallowed. Margaret Quinn. The name landed without sound, but Devin felt it all the same. Quinn had been on the volunteer rosters. EMT certification. Local. Born and raised. The kind of woman who brought casseroles when someone got hurt and never stayed long enough to be thanked. What happened between her and Jonah? Devin asked. Lydia's mouth tightened. Her sister came through town one winter. Strung out. Sick. Jonah offered her work. Housing. Devin closed his eyes briefly. And? She didn't last a month, Lydia said. Overdose, officially. Quiet cremation, no autopsy. Jonah told Margaret it was her fault for not keeping an eye on her. Carmen cursed softly under her breath. Lydia continued, voice steadier now, like something inside her had finally aligned. After that, Jonah changed. He got sloppier, arrogant. Started talking about how he could make people disappear if he wanted to. Said the town owed him. And Margaret? Devin asked. She kept working, Lydia said, smiling, helping, waiting. The heater clicked again. Devin straightened. You think she killed him. I think she decided he didn't get to keep the last word, Lydia said. And I think she wanted him found. Carmen leaned forward. Because of the stitches. Lydia nodded once. Jonah hated silence. He hated not being able to talk his way out. Sewing his mouth shut wasn't rage, it was precision. Devin shut the recorder off. "Stay here," he said. "We'll have someone with you." Outside, night had deepened. Snow began to fall again, slow and heavy, muting sound. Devon stood on the station steps for a moment, letting cold burn clarity back into him. "Quinn lives on the west side," Carmen said, coming up beside him, "near the old boatyard." "Alone?" Devon asked. "Widowed. No kids." They drove without sirens. Margaret Quinn's house was modest. Lights on, curtains open. A kind of openness that felt intentional. Devon noted the cleared walkway, the shoveled steps. Someone who prepared for visitors. He knocked. Margaret answered immediately. She was in her late 40s, hair pulled back, face lined by years of wind and worry. She wore scrubs under a thick cardigan. Her eyes flicked from Devon's badge to Carmen's stance and softened. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. Devon studied her hands. "Clean, steady." "May we come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like soup and antiseptic. Medical textbooks lined one shelf. On the coffee table sat a neatly folded black coat, still damp at the hem. "Where were you last night, Margaret?" Devon asked. "At the clinic," she said. "Inventory." Carmen glanced at Devon. "The clinic's been closed for years." Margaret smiled faintly. "Some things don't stop needing attention." Devon stepped closer. "Did Jonas Smith come to you?" Margaret met his eyes without flinching. "Yes." "What did he want?" "To remind me," she said. "To tell me he still had the photos. To ask for money. And you refused." "I told him I remembered everything," she replied. He laughed. Devon nodded slowly. "Did you sew his mouth shut?" Margaret exhaled. Long, deep, relief, not fear. "Yes," she said, "after he was dead." "How did he die?" Carmen asked. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the window, where snow blurred the dark. "Insulin," she said, "enough to make him sleep. Then stopped breathing. He was diabetic. I knew his dose." "Why the sea?" Devon asked. "So he'd come back," Margaret said. "So you'd look. So his records would surface." Devon felt the case settle into its final shape. Not neat, but complete. "You know this doesn't end with you walking free," he said. Margaret nodded. "I know." Carmen cuffed her gently. As they let her out, Margaret paused at the door and looked back once at the warm light, the books, the ordinary life she'd carried while waiting. "He thought silence was power," she said quietly. "I wanted him to learn what it feels like." Outside, snow covered their footprints almost immediately. The sea moved in the dark, patient as ever, already deciding what it would keep and what it would return. Margaret Quinn didn't struggle when they put her in the cruiser. She sat upright in the back seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward, as if she were being driven somewhere she'd already imagined in detail. Snow ticked softly against the windshield. The town was quiet in the way it got after something finally stopped fighting. Devon Burrow watched the cruiser pull away, then turned back toward the house. The porch light was still on. Warm, domestic. It felt obscene. Inside, Tex moved carefully, cataloging what Margaret hadn't bothered to hide. Syringes in a locked tin. Medical-grade insulin vials with pharmacy labels Jonas Smith's name still clinging to them like an accusation. A sewing kit identical to the one found at the cannery clinic. Black thread wound tight, needle wiped clean. In the kitchen trash, wrapped in paper towels, they found a single glove. Latex. Powder-free, used once, disposed of correctly. She knew exactly what she was doing, Carmen Lyle said quietly. Devon nodded. and exactly how long it would take us to get here. By morning, Blackwater Cove had shifted. News traveled fast in winter towns. Faster than radio, faster than phones. People stood in doorways longer than usual. Conversations happened in half-voices that stopped when deputies passed. Some faces carried relief. Others carried something like mourning, but not for Jonah Smith. At the courthouse, Margaret waived her right to counsel. She sat at the table in county-issue blues, posture straight, hands still. When the judge asked if she understood the charges, first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, she answered calmly, yes. No qualifiers. No speeches. Devon testified that afternoon. He laid out the evidence in a sequence that felt clinical until he reached the photographs. The room changed then. The jurors leaned back as if distance might help. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth and didn't uncover it again. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood without prompting. "I am not asking for mercy," she said. Her voice carried easily, practiced from years of keeping it level in emergencies. "I am asking for accuracy." She spoke about her sister, about the clinic, about Jonah Smith's records and leverage and the way the town had taught itself not to see what made life inconvenient. "I didn't kill him in anger," she said. "I killed him to stop him, and I wanted him found. I wanted his silence to make noise." The judge listened without expression. The sentence came quickly. Life, with the possibility of parole decades down the line, enough distance that it felt theoretical, not hopeful. Margaret nodded once when it was delivered, like a diagnosis she'd already accepted. Outside, the cannery came down faster than anyone expected. State funds. Emergency designation. Within a week, heavy machinery tore into the building, pulling walls apart, exposing rooms that had been sealed by rot and neglect. Reporters filmed from the road, careful not to linger too long on any single opening. In the clinic annex, they found more evidence Jonah had thought time would erase. Old tapes, partial logs, names that spread outward like cracks. Some of those men left town before they could be questioned. Others stayed and answered carefully. A few were arrested. It wasn't enough. It never was. Devon spent his last night in Blackwater Cove walking the shoreline alone. Snow had hardened into crusted ridges along the beach. The sea was calm, dark, uninterested. He stopped where the body had come up. The tide moved in and out, indifferent to narrative, to justice, to intent. It had given Jonah back, because someone had wanted it to. It would take other things without asking. Carmen joined him after a while, boots crunching softly. "You heading out tomorrow?" she asked. "Yeah," she nodded. "Town will talk about this for years." "Until something else gives them permission not to," Devon said. She glanced toward the dark shape of the cannery ruins. "You think she was right?" Devon considered the question longer than it deserved. "I think she chose the only ending that made sense to her," he said. "Doesn't make it clean." Carmen smiled faintly. "Nothing ever is." Morning came gray and thin. Devon packed his car and drove Seaward Road one last time. Jonah Smith's house sat empty now, porch light off, windows dark. A notice had been taped to the door. Condemnation pending. Investigation ongoing. The snow would erase the footprints soon enough. As Devon reached the highway, the radio caught a signal again. Static resolving into a weather report, then a commercial, then nothing important at all. Ordinary sound, earned sound. Behind him, Blackwater Cove receded into fog and shoreline and memory. The sea kept moving. It always did. But this time, it had given something back that refused to sink quietly. Now, let's start the next story that we have. The desert went quiet. the way skin does right before it breaks. Detective Rowan Beck felt it before he saw anything wrong, an absence of sound so complete it pressed against his ears. Even the wind had stopped. The engine ticked as it cooled, metal contracting, the only reminder he wasn't alone out there. San Esteban lay ahead, half a mile of asphalt and dust, pretending to be a town. One road straight through. Nothing branching off that didn't look temporary or abandoned. The Mirador Motel crouched at the far end, like a confession no one wanted to make, its neon sign flickering MRDR, the rest long dead. The call had been incomplete. Border County Dispatcher. Broken transmission. Possible deceased. Room 6 not responding. Smells. Smells were never good. Rowan stepped out of the car and the heat wrapped around him again, thick even this late in the day. The air carried something sweet beneath the dust, synthetic, cloying. He recognized it immediately. Cleaning solvent, heavy duty, the kind people used when they wanted to erase something instead of just tidy up. The motel office door stood open. Inside, the desk fan was still running, pushing hot air in slow circles. A ledger lay open, last entry scrawled in shaky ink. Room 6. Paid cash. 3 nights. Rowan didn't call out. Towns like this heard you whether you spoke or not. The walkway outside Room 6 was cracked concrete. Cigarette burns like constellations pressed into its surface. The door itself was shut, but not locked. A strip of painter's tape had been placed across the handle, neat and deliberate, like someone marking a boundary. Rowan peeled it away. The smell hit harder inside. Not decomposition. Not yet. Whatever it had been done recently and aggressively. Leech burned the back of his throat. Pine cleaner. Something floral layered on top. An almost desperate attempt at normalcy. The room lights were on. The bed was gone. Not stripped. Not overturned. Gone. The mattress, frame, box spring, removed entirely, leaving a clean rectangle of lighter carpet beneath, as if the room had been skinned. Against the far wall sat a plastic chair, cheap, white, one leg cracked and repaired with duct tape. In the center of the room was a drain, new, cut directly into the concrete slab, edges still rough. Around it, the floor was darker, scrubbed repeatedly, but never enough. Stains bled upward no matter how hard someone tried to push them down. Rowan crouched and touched the concrete. Still damp. On the nightstand lay a phone. Not broken. Not hidden. Placed carefully. Screen wiped clean of prints. Rowan powered it on. No passcode. The home screen photo loaded slowly. A man stared back at him. Mid-30s. Shaved head. Eyes slightly crossed, like they didn't quite agree on what they were seeing. He was smiling, but only with his mouth. Behind him, desert scrub and a hand-painted sign. "Welcome to San Esteban," Rowan scrolled. Photos. Hundreds of them. Always the same chair. The same room. Different people. Men. Women. Some young. Some old. All seated, hands visible, eyes fixed on the camera. Some looked confused. Some terrified. A few were crying openly. Timestamps stretched back months. Rowan's pulse slowed, sharpened. This wasn't a murder scene. It was a studio. He stood and scanned the room again, slower now. He saw the hooks in the ceiling he'd missed before, 4 of them, recently installed. He saw the faint scrape marks where something heavy had been dragged toward the drain. He saw the absence where a mirror had been removed from the wall, its outline still visible like a ghost. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Rowan turned, just as a man appeared in the doorway. Local deputy by the look of him. Sweat-darkened uniform. Two young eyes trying to look older. "Detective Beck?" the deputy asked. Rowan nodded once. The deputy swallowed. "We found something else." "Where?" The deputy didn't answer right away. He just pointed past the motel, toward the open desert where the sun had finally dipped below the horizon. "Out by the dry wash," he said. "There's a line of them." "A line of what?" The deputy's voice dropped. "Graves. Shallow. All marked." Rowan followed him back into the heat, the motel door swinging shut behind them. In San Esteban, someone hadn't just been killing people, they'd been keeping records. And they were still close enough to smell the bleach. The dry wash cut through the desert like a scar that never healed. Rowan Beck stood at its edge, while deputies worked under portable lights, their beams slicing through dust and darkness. The ground here was pale and brittle, packed hard by years of flash floods and heat. Someone had disturbed it anyway, again and again. The first grave was barely a foot deep. A boot toe protruded from the soil, leather split and curling like dead skin. The body beneath was male, middle-aged, wrapped in a plastic tarp secured with duct tape. The tape had been sliced cleanly down the center, as if whoever buried him had wanted him accessible later, or remembered. Each grave was marked, not with names, with numbers, spray-painted onto flat stones, placed carefully at the head. 17, 18, 19. Rowan crouched, studying the spacing. Uniform, measured. The graves followed the curve of the wash like milestones, disappearing into darkness beyond the lights. "How many so far?" Rowan asked. The deputy, his name was Torres, according to the patch, ran a hand through his hair. "We stopped counting at 30. There's more farther out. We didn't want to, you know." Rowan nodded. Digging blindly destroyed context. Whoever had done this understood order, pattern, escalation. "These people reported missing?" Rowan asked. Torres shook his head. "Some, maybe. A lot of drifters come through here, seasonal workers. Border traffic, folks who don't get looked for." Rowan felt the weight of that settle. San Esteban wasn't random, it was chosen. Back at the motel, crime scene tape fluttered uselessly in the warm night breeze. The room felt smaller, now that Rowan knew what it had been used for. He stood near the drain again, staring at the hooks overhead. 4 hooks. 4 was deliberate. Interrogation? Restraint? Display? He replayed the photos on the phone in his mind. The consistency. Same angle. Same distance. Same lighting. This wasn't improvisation. This was ritual. Torres hovered near the door, uneasy. "Sheriff's on his way from Las Cruces. State, too." "Good," Rowan said. "Lock the town down anyway." Torres blinked. "The whole town?" Rowan turned slowly. "This didn't happen without help. Power, silence, supplies." Somebody noticed. Somebody always notices. Outside, a pickup truck idled across the lot, headlights off. Rowan hadn't seen it arrive. He watched it through the blinds. The driver didn't get out, didn't turn off the engine. Just sat there, silhouette motionless against the dash glow. Rowan felt a familiar tightening behind his ribs. "Who's that?" he asked. Torres glanced, then shrugged too fast. "Probably Eli Navarro. Owns the bar. He checks on things." "Checks on what?" Torres didn't answer. Rowan stepped out into the heat. The truck's window rolled down halfway. Eli Navarro was late 40s, weathered, eyes sunken and alert. His hands rested on the wheel, relaxed but ready. Hell of a night, Eli said. You're not supposed to be here, Rowan replied. Eli smiled faintly. Town small. Hard to miss the lights. Rowan leaned slightly, catching the smell inside the cab. Bleach. Not strong. Faint. Recently masked. How long you lived here, Eli? All my life. Mirador always been open? On and off. Depends who's asking. Rowan held his gaze. Anyone else have access to room 6? Eli's smile thinned. That room's cursed. Cursed how? People don't stay long. Rowan straightened. Neither do bodies. For the first time, Eli looked away. Sheriff will handle it, Eli muttered. Best let him. Rowan watched the truck pull away, tires crunching softly as it vanished into the dark. He went back inside and studied the phone again. The timestamps weren't random. They followed a rhythm. Every 8 to 10 days. Enough time to clean. Reset. Wait. The most recent photo was taken 2 nights ago. The subject was a woman. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. But she was alive, and staring directly into the lens with something sharper than fear. Defiance. Rowan zoomed in. Reflected in her pupil was a shape he hadn't noticed before. A man standing behind the camera. Broad shoulders. Ball cap. A sheriff's badge glinting faintly at his chest. Rowan exhaled, slowly. This wasn't a predator hiding in the desert. This was infrastructure. And it was still operating. Rowan Beck didn't confront the sheriff that night. That was the mistake people made when they thought justice was a single motion instead of a sequence. You rush the center and everything collapses in the wrong direction. He'd learned that years ago. Learned it the hard way, with a badge that had once meant less than it should have. Instead, he watched. The sheriff arrived just after midnight in an unmarked SUV, lights off until the last second. He stepped out calm, unhurried, gray-haired and broad, the kind of man people trusted because he looked like he'd always been there. Sheriff Derek Hume. 22 years in office. Ran, unopposed, the last 3 elections. Hume surveyed the motel, nodded at deputies, placed a steadying hand on one shoulder, murmured something Rowan couldn't hear. The machinery of reassurance spun up around him immediately. Rowan stayed back, unreadable. Hume's eyes found him anyway. They locked for a beat too long. Detective Beck, Hume said as he approached. Hell of a mess. Rowan nodded. It's organized. Hume's smile was faint. Professional. We'll get to the bottom of it. Rowan watched him say it. Watched how easily the words came. Inside the temporary command room, maps were spread, bodies numbered, coffee poured. Rowan noticed what didn't happen. No one mentioned the number of graves aloud. No one suggested expanding the search past the wash. No one asked who'd signed off on permits, utilities, the motel staying open without inspections. Infrastructure didn't just exist. It was maintained. Rowan slipped out after an hour and drove straight to Navarro's bar. It was the only place still open, lights low, windows blacked out. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and ammonia. A few men sat scattered, nursing drinks they weren't enjoying. When Rowan entered, conversation didn't stop. It never started again. Eli Navarro stood behind the bar, wiping the same spot over and over. Rowan took a seat. You close soon, Rowan said. Eli shrugged. Soon as folks leave, they won't. Eli finally looked at him. You think you know what's happening here? I think you know who brings them in. Eli's jaw tightened. Drifters come through all the time. Not in patterns, Rowan said. Not with photos. Silence stretched. Rowan slid his phone across the bar and turned it so Eli could see. The woman's face filled the screen. Her defiance. The reflection in her eye. Eli closed his eyes. "Where did they get taken before the motel?" Rowan asked. Eli swallowed. "The old processing yard. South of town. Trucks used to line up there." "And after?" Eli's voice dropped. "You saw the wash." Rowan leaned closer. "Who chooses them?" Eli laughed once, bitter. "Sheriff says it's mercy. Says no one misses them. Says it keeps the town safe." Rowan stood. Outside, dawn was beginning to bruise the horizon. He drove south, past rusted fencing and collapsed sheds, until the desert opened into a flat, fenced yard, littered with old floodlights. One of the lights was on. Inside the yard stood a woman tied to a chair, alive. Rowan stepped out of the car and raised his weapon. "Police!" he shouted. "Hands where I can see them." A figure emerged from behind a truck. Not Hume. Eli. His hands were empty, his face wrecked. "I couldn't do it anymore," Eli said. "They said tonight was the last one. They always say that." Rowan moved past him, cutting the woman free. She sagged forward, sobbing, breath tearing out of her in raw animal sounds. Headlights flared behind them, several sets. Rowan turned slowly. Sheriff Hume's SUV rolled to a stop at the fence. Deputies spilled out, weapons drawn, but not aimed at Rowan. Aimed inward. Hume stepped forward, hands open. "You should have left, Detective," he said calmly. "This town survives because we decide who doesn't." Rowan felt the moment settle into place. Clean. Final. He lifted his radio. "This is Detective Rowan Beck," he said clearly. "I have confirmation of an organized homicide operation involving local law enforcement in San Esteban. Suspects on scene. Civilian hostage recovered alive." Static answered him. Then, another voice cutting through. "Copy that, Detective. Keep your line open." Hume's expression changed for the first time. Not fear. Calculation. Rowan kept his gun steady. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust, carrying sound. And for the first time in a long time, San Esteban was about to be heard. The silence after the radio call was worse than gunfire. Sheriff Derek Hume stood very still, hands still open, as if he might yet talk his way out of gravity. The deputies behind him shifted, uncertain now, eyes flicking between Rowan Beck's gun and the woman slumped against the truck, coughing and crying into her own hands. "You hear that?" Rowan said evenly. "That was the outside." Hume smiled, thin and patient. "Radios lie out here. Towers go down. Batteries die, you know that." Rowan didn't answer. He watched the deputies instead. Two of them were young. One had sweat running freely down his neck. Another kept swallowing, his Adam's apple bobbing like it wanted to escape. The wind carried a sound then. Low, distant, unmistakable. Rotor blades. Hume's eyes lifted to the darkening sky. "Just a flicker of irritation. Nothing more. Doesn't change the math," Hume said. "You're one man. You don't have jurisdiction. And by the time anyone lands, this will be resolved." "Resolved how?" Rowan asked. Hume sighed, like a father disappointed by a slow child. "Same way it always is." One of the deputies stepped back. Then another. Eli Navarro dropped to his knees, hands behind his head, shaking so badly his teeth chattered. "I told him everything," he blurted. "The motel, the wash, the photos, I'm done." Hume didn't look at him. "You always were." The helicopter crested the horizon, its searchlight snapping on, bathing the yard in white so bright it erased shadows. Dust exploded upward. The deputies flinched. A loudspeaker crackled. "San Esteban Sheriff's Office. Stand down. Weapons on the ground." Hume finally turned his head toward Rowan. "You think they'll understand?" he asked quietly. "What it took to keep this place standing?" Rowan stepped closer, gun unwavering. "You didn't keep it standing. You hollowed it out." The woman Rowan had freed lifted her head. Her face was a map of pain, but her eyes were sharp. "He took pictures," she said hoarsely. "Said it was important to remember who we were before." Hume closed his eyes for a moment. Then he reached for his gun. Rowan fired first. The shot took Hume in the thigh, dropping him hard into the dirt. Deputies shouted. Someone fired into the air. The helicopter descended rapidly, dust and noise swallowing everything. Rowan kicked Hume's weapon away and cuffed him himself, fingers numb but precise. By sunrise, it was over. State investigators sealed the town. Federal teams took over the graves. The Mirador Motel was boarded up, its sign finally dark. Deputies were separated, questioned. Some arrested on the spot. Others broke down and told everything they knew, which was more than they'd ever admitted to themselves. Rowan sat on the hood of his car as the woman, her name was Maribel, was loaded into an ambulance. She met his eyes and nodded once, the same way survivors always did when words were too heavy. "You're not done," she said. "No," Rowan agreed. "But you are safe." San Esteban emptied quickly after that. People left in trucks and buses and borrowed cars, carrying whatever stories they could justify. The desert reclaimed the rest. Weeks later, Rowan stood alone at the edge of the dry wash. The stones with numbers had been bagged and cataloged. The ground lay open, exposed, unable to pretend anymore. The wind moved through it all without judgment. Rowan turned back toward the road. Some places didn't deserve to survive. They deserved to be seen. They moved Derek Hume before the heat set in. Rowan Beck watched from the edge of the courthouse lot as the stretcher slid into the transport van, the sheriff's leg bound, his hands cuffed in front of him like a courtesy he no longer deserved. Hume didn't look back. He stared at the ceiling, lips moving slightly, counting something only he could see. Inside, the building smelled like old paper and panic. Investigators from 3 agencies worked in parallel lines, careful not to intersect more than necessary. Evidence boxes stacked up fast, hard drives from the motel office, film canisters from a footlocker beneath the bar, receipts for cleaning chemicals purchased weekly for years. Infrastructure, Rowan thought. Always the unglamorous part. In an interview room with a one-way mirror, Hume finally spoke. "You want motive," he said, voice steady despite the morphine's drag. "Here it is, entropy. Towns like ours rot unless you prune them. You cut away what attracts flies." Rowan didn't react. Hume smiled. "You think I chose at random? I chose the uncounted. The ones already halfway gone. We gave them order. We gave them documentation." "You documented suffering," Rowan said. Hume's eyes sharpened. "We documented obedience." Down the hall, Eli Navarro's confession played out in a different register. Ragged, unspooling. Names came out in bursts. Deputies. Utility workers. A county inspector who signed off on permits he never checked. The processing yard's floodlights paid for through a shell account labeled civic improvements. When they brought out the photos, even the hardened agents went quiet. The victims were cataloged by posture, by how long they maintained eye contact, by how long before their hands shook. Training data. Hume called it when they showed him. Rowan left before the word could settle. Outside, the desert had turned a pale, indifferent blue. The Mirador Motel was already boarded up, the sign hauled down. Without it, the place looked smaller, almost harmless. They exhumed the wash methodically over the next 10 days. 46 bodies, 47 names. Some matched missing persons reports from 3 states. Others had no paper trail at all. They were given names anyway. Maribel testified last. She spoke softly, without looking at Hume, describing the chair, the drain, the count he kept out loud so he wouldn't forget where he was. When she finished, the courtroom didn't move. Hume listened with the same patient expression he'd worn for decades. When it was his turn, he declined counsel and spoke for 11 minutes. "We were careful," he said. "We were quiet. That's the crime you can't forgive." The judge didn't look up when he sentenced him. Rowan drove out of San Esteban the morning the roadblocks came down. The town was emptier now, not because people had been taken, but because they'd chosen to leave. The desert swallowed the sound of his tires within a mile. He stopped once at the dry wash. The stones were gone. The numbers, too. The ground had been smoothed and reseeded, a lie told with good intentions. Rowan stood there anyway, long enough to feel the heat climb and the wind turn. Seeing was the work, he thought. After that, you let the land decide what remains. He got back in the car and drove until the radio found a signal again, the static resolving into ordinary noise. Ordinary felt earned.